Right around the breakup of his relationship with Sigmund Freud, in the pivotal year of 1914, 38-year-old Carl Gustav Jung started experiencing fearful vision of a looming catastrophe. For nearly a year, Jung believed that these visions were pulling him away from reality and into a realm of intense suffering and sorrow. Upon learning of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, followed by the outbreak of the Great War, Jung could breathe a sigh of relief. He wasn't going mad, his entire civilization was. Contemplating his personal tragedy and the one unfolding across Europe, Jung had a change of heart regarding the fantasies that flooded his mind. Now, he was working on inviting them in, to witness what comes and to record every sight and every sound in an effort to understand. Understand what exactly, he wasn't sure. The period which Jung would later term as his confrontation with the unconscious was about to begin. It will last until 1930, and then for a brief period in 1959, Jung will return to it, only to trail off in the middle of a sentence and so to leave the writing of his Liber Novus unfinished. The Red Book, as it is known to most of us, was finally published in 2009. Its editor is my guest today, Professor Sonu Shamdasani. Hi, Sonu.
Hi.
Sonu is an historian of psychology and professor at University College London. He is the author of Jung and the Making of Modern Psychology, The Dream of a Science, and Cult Fictions, C.G. Jung and the Founding of Analytical Psychology. And as I said, he is also the editor of the Red Book, which we'll talk about in this episode. So Sonu, I'm very happy and honored to have you here with us. And I want to start out by setting the scene, just as you did in your introduction to the Red Book. And to do that, I want to ask you about spiritualism, because from reading your articles, I've learned that this movement, if we can call it that, and I mean spiritualism again, played a major part not only in Jung's formation of the Red Book, but in the history of psychology and the discovery of the unconscious. Could you maybe tell us that story?
It's a large topic, and that could be enough for an hour by itself. And one of my former PhD students, Andreas Sommer, who has a blog called Forbidden Knowledge, has written a major study of spiritualism, psychical research, and the making of psychology, which will be out in the next couple of years as a monograph. Basically, there really isn't much of a line between psychology and psychical research at the turn of the century. And then some of the most advanced psychology was under the rubric of psychical research. I say psychical research to differentiate it from spiritualism. So at the end of the 19th century, a lot of psychologists were turning to study mediums, spiritualistic phenomena, not just to look for proof of survival, but to understand the psychology of mediumship, what was going on and how was this possible. And this was something that attracted Jung, and indeed he had I would say a lifelong fascination with mediums. If there was ever a good medium in town, he would go and check them out. And so his dissertation is a study of his cousin, who he experimented with in his days as a medical student. And he doesn't look upon it in terms of any kind of, you could say, spiritual phenomena, but is trying to understand what is taking place. So he understands her transpersonalities, and one of them as an attempt for a future personality to break through as a sort of in a developmental kind of manner. Some of the techniques there of entering a trance, of engaging in automatic writing, in engaging in visualizations, forms, you could say, part of the context for his later method of active imagination. So Jung was also experienced as a hypnotist. He was very good as a hypnotist, so was quite capable of taking people in and out of trances, in and out of different states, asking them to visualize things, asking them to write, to describe what they see. And so this forms, you could say, part of the context for his own practice of active imagination.
And the more I read about active imagination, that seems very connected, and there's something very interesting that you write in your introduction to the Red Book, that we living today are actually living after the divide between what you term, I think, psychology and psycho. How did you call it?
Psychology, psychical research, spiritualism, literature.
Yeah, and is it actually impossible to imagine today some psychologist writing a book like the Red Book?
That's an interesting question. I think you'd have individuals writing it. It's harder to imagine them taking place with someone that is a card-carrying psychologist or with a position in a university.
And is it because, I mean, I'm thinking about Jung asking himself while doing active imagination, not even still understanding that he's writing a serious work. I think he's asking himself, what am I doing? Is it science? Is it art? And his subconscious, a female voice answering, this is art, and he is not accepting that answer. I mean, what in the end did he formulate? What answer did he give to what he was doing in the Red Book, or in the Black Books, actually?
He didn't see his symbolic productions as art, but as a form of self-exploration. I think the material he wrote down was literally records of a self-experiment. And in his view, the material itself is neutral. You can use that material to make art. You can use that material to try to create prophecies. You can use that material to try to create literature. Jung was trying to use that same material to make psychology or to understand the visionary process. And just take his productions and aesthetically shape them and put them out to the public. He wanted to understand the psychology of the vision-making process. And he wanted to understand the meaning of the content rather than just put them for others to look at.
And this is what he says, that he's actually, all his work is derived from this experience, which took him many years. I mean, not
That's right,
from
yeah.
1914 to 1930.
Longer. He spent the rest of his life trying to figure out the significance of the material and establishing cross-cultural parallels and developing his notion of the individuation process. So that took literally the rest of his life, was meditating in part directly, for the most part indirectly, on the significance of the material that he experienced during those years.
Yeah, and I'm asking myself, do you think that we need to read the Red Book in order to understand Jung later scientific development of that material, or is it enough to read his books and his articles, many of them?
I mean, you can do both. I mean, there are books that are clearly there and have been read and understood and have been influential in their own right. Jung was what I call an esotericist. He wrote on two levels. There's his private elaboration of his own cosmology and his own self-understanding, and material that he was putting in his books addressed towards a medical and scientific audience. And where he was not saying everything, he was keeping some stuff hidden, in a way, the basis of his ideas. And the issue is when you read the Red Book and his Black Books, the first notebooks in which he wrote down his experiences, it's far easier to understand his later work. It snaps into focus. You see the experiences he's basing his ideas on. You see what he's trying to convey in direct, immediate language rather than an abstract terminology, and just on the basis of first-hand experience. So it becomes much easier to grasp what he's trying to convey, and also you understand, you can begin to see the psychology making process, how he tried to construct a would-be interdisciplinary science of psychology, or complex psychology as he called it.
And how did he came up with this process or idea? Because, while you were talking, I was thinking about William Blake. And William Blake wasn't a scientist, so he never saw himself as a scientist, and he had some critical things to say about science, but he experienced visions from since he was a child, basically, and he created with them poetry. But I mean, treating your visions. I mean, first of all, I mean, I don't know if it's that different because Blake always talked about his visions as appearing only in his mind. So he did understand the fact that he's not seeing anything that is actually exterior to himself. But he didn't go out and elaborate a whole psychology from it. He did create a mythology.
Yeah, it's a very interesting parallel. And in a way, the edition I published of the Red Book, I took in a way my inspiration from the facsimile editions of Blake's illuminated manuscripts, and did spend a lot of time studying Blake whilst I was doing it, which I'd done so before. So Blake didn't see himself as a scientist, but again, if you bracket out the word science, for Blake, observation is important, precision is important, correct notation is important. So he's trying to observe things carefully, and he's trying to record things and portray things carefully. So in a sense, there is a certain, if you put it broadly, phenomenological attitude by which he's regarding his material that is exactly what Jung is doing. It's true, he's not then using that as a basis of a science, but he is drawing, could say, ethical implications. He is coming up with, you could say, moral statements or judgments or notions of how one should live. But again, it's in relation to the times in which he's living in. And yes, he is developing his own mythology that's there in these magnificent illuminated manuscripts. Jung is fascinated by Blake, but in a way he sees a certain similarity, but takes a certain distance from it. And I think, again, because of the aesthetic and prophetic form in which Blake casts his material. And I would say, in terms of anyone reading Blake, if you want to enter Blake's world, it takes quite a serious study to enter into it. It's not something you can do just by reading the books. It takes quite an immersion to do so.
Which is different from the Red Book?
Actually, no, it's not. They have that in common.
And just today, I've listened to a lecture you gave about the descent to hell, and you give various examples, Dante and Swedenborg and Blake, and there's a very interesting notion that you put there that Blake's critique is about Swedenborg not talking to devils, and I think that Jung got that and actually talked with I don't know, devils, but he talks to various very different creatures in his mind in the Red Book and actually descending into hell.
That's right.
And first of all, why should we descend to hell in a sense? And what can we find in there? Because he starts out in a desert and not in hell, Jung in the Red Book.
As to the why, Jung says often it's not why, but you just find yourself there. So you don't have much of a choice. I mean, you just
in a dark wood.
You switch on CNN and it's there. So the question is, for Jung, it's ineluctable. It's not a choice. You find yourself going down.
I think like Dante finding himself in a dark wood and not knowing the way out. And he also has a guide. I mean, it's almost a necessary condition, or actually a necessary condition. You have to descend with a guide, no, to lead you back, or to lead you
to finish the first point. For Jung, it's like you find yourself going down. So in a way, it's a question of not resisting that movement, of not immediately saying, "Get me out of here. Let me rush back to the surface," of just accepting that moment and then exploring what is there. So not resisting that downward moment is the issue. You're forced down, you're pulled down by so many life circumstances.
And is it, going down and finding yourself in trouble, basically? I mean, in a very, I guess, very difficult mental position. Is it for Jung himself, because as he writes, and you quote, that he had to admit that I was living with no myth or even in a myth. I mean, is it the mythlessness of his life, if you can say that, that got him into trouble?
Well, that's his understanding. That's what leads him to sort of begin to study his own fantasies, begin to, in a sense, part of the rationale for his self-investigation comes from his book Transformations in Symbols and Libido, where he'd argue that there is this fantasies thinking which you see in myths, in religious, in folklore, in everyone. It's still present. So he turns to study his own fantasies to try to see, okay, is there anything meaningful there?
I mean, it's a very general question, but what does he find in there? I mean, I'm reminded by he wrote an article about active imagination, and there's the conscious part and the unconscious part, and basically, I think he's telling us that his modern society, and maybe ours, is turning away from the unconscious, because we have to use conscious thinking and logic to create our own society. But what do we lose when we are actually turning our backs to the unconscious?
Well, in his view, in his historical view, for many people, it wasn't an option to turn back to religious traditions if you'd fallen out of them. If you were within them, well and good, that's fine. You have a system, you have a system that gives you meaning and support and a symbolism by which to understand both life and the relations to what is beyond human. So for him, the only resource then for such individuals who found they were unable to turn back to religious traditions is to look within, is to find, in a way, their own iconography. And that, for Jung, begins by looking at one's own fantasies. And in his view, what you find there actually did parallel what one found in the great religious traditions, but it was described in his own personal iconography, in his own images, rather than in pre-given systems, pre-given symbols. So in doing that, he found a source of renewal for himself. It enabled him to find a way to go on living and to find meaning in his life.
Yeah, I think he divides, at least initially, but he talks about them throughout the work, about the spirit of the time and the spirit of the depth.
That's right, yeah.
And what are these two distinctions?
Well, he claimed that the spirit of the times, which he'd been following in his life for the previous decade, is what dominated the contemporary world. It's the rationalism that he'd been following. You could say the scientific naturalism and psychology without a soul, as he called it. Yeah, contemporary secular rational worldview.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, that would be a prime sort of example of what Jung called the spirit of the times. And he contrasted that with just everything else, a sense of mystery in the world, of there being something more.
There being something, I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Something more than secular rationalism.
Yeah.
There being a mystery to the universe.
And is that connected to the collective unconscious, the sense that our soul is more ancient than our bodies or our memories? I mean, I might be 35 years old, but I'm actually an ancient soul, as they say it.
In a way, it's connected, but they're not. It's not a one-to-one translation. The collective unconscious, you could say, is like a makeshift by which he's trying to express some of these ideas in a form that the medical science of his day would be able to accept. In a way, he's trying to translate the spirit of the depths into the spirit of the times by trying to express this in a more rationalistic manner.
Yeah, I'm thinking about there's to me, it's a very beautiful insight just at the start of the Red Book when he's talking about the ancients not being able to see the world as it is. They only saw it in images. And when they felt that their soul is a desert, they went to the desert. And I'm guessing that he's probably thinking about the fathers of the Christian church, or the monks, the early monks, and
Yeah.
so on. But in a sense, I mean, it's like it's like a puzzle with two pieces. No, we have the rational thinking, but not the images, or we're not listening to the images, and they had the images, but not the rational thinking. Obviously, it's a gross simplification. I think maybe even Jung
Yeah.
thought that.
I mean, what he's trying to say there is, in a way, they lived it. They didn't reflect on it. So they lived something. They were in their experience, but they didn't see it as an image.
And is he actually, by writing the black notebooks and the red book, is he teaching us that psychology is something that you need to experience? I mean, working on yourself. It's not just going to a therapist, I don't know, an hour a week. It's a process, it's a work.
Well, I mean, just to finish that, I mean, he says we have the images, but we don't take them seriously. We don't value the images that we have and realize that they are a potential source of renewal. So to take seriously one's own fantasy is the first, you could say, lesson that he draws from his self-experimentation. I don't think he certainly wasn't universalizing. He was like saying, okay, this is something that he had no choice but to do, and that there were others in the same predicament. But he wasn't trying to say this is what everyone should do. Certainly not. In a way, he says you do this when you've got no other option.
It's a specific place when you get to hell, in a
Yeah.
sense. And I saw a few of your a few talks, and read a few articles that you wrote, and there's obviously you're an historian of psychology and psychoanalysis and Jung's, and there's a sense that I feel that you're trying to correct, and it's a, I don't know, maybe a misunderstanding, to see Jung's psychology as coming from Freud's psychoanalysis. And there's even a point I think it's in the introduction, or it's in some, I mean, Jung said it at some point, that Freud's hope that the unconscious could be exhausted has not been fulfilled. What does Jung mean by the unconscious can be exhausted? I mean, Freud thought that basically we can get rid of it.
Yeah, he did. If you completely sorted out all of your neuroses, according to Freud, you'd stop dreaming. You would have emptied out. You would have dealt with all your oppressions. So the unconscious would have been emptied out. I mean, that was Freud's view. I mean, Jung had, I would say, a much mythologized relation with Freud that was significant for both parties, but he was by no means ever a disciple of Freud, and his ideas didn't come out of Freud or his so-called break with Freud. He had his own scientific perspective and philosophical background established before he met Freud, or you could say the basis of his thinking. If you look even at the situation around 1906, when his head, Eugen Bleuler and Jung, come out in support of Freud, if you read the German psychiatric literature, the statement is, well, you know, Freud is like a neurologist with a rather dodgy reputation for like his seduction theory and his botched experiments with cocaine. But when people of the seriousness of Bleuler and Jung, of people of the standing of Bleuler and Jung take this stuff serious, we have to listen to them. It's Freud, so it's Jung and Bleuler that put Freud on the map, not the other way around, and give psychoanalysis a hearing in the German psychiatric and psychological world. So yes, he's 19 years younger, but I mean, Freud, if you look at it, spent many of his if the first part of his career in neurology. Jung is not really that far apart in terms of his actual output in comparison to Freud, maybe like a decade rather than 2 decades in terms of his scientific output. But it's really Bleuler and Jung that are putting Freud on the map. And it's with the advent of Jung and Bleuler that an international psychoanalytic movement starts, of which Jung was one of the co-architects. And far from his experiences with the Red Book as stemming from his so-called break with Freud. I mean, I think he was, if you look at it, the Zurich group left by, I think, a vote of, I remember offhand, 14 or 15 to 1 to leave the psychoanalytic movement because Freud put authority above truth. They're cracking over the champagne. I mean, they're not depressed. And if you look at the work that they're doing, there's a massive outbreak of creativity. In a way, the tyrant is gone. It's an act of liberation, and you see that those are the most creative years in Jung's life. This was not a traumatic experience. It was freedom from oppression and captivity, intellectual captivity. And you even look at that chronologically. Jung has completed the fantasies that make up the first 2 books of Liber Novus, the Red Book, before he's left the psychoanalytic movement. He's completed that by spring and early summer of 1914. It's that he's refound his relation to his soul. He's refound his religious orientation. He's refound the courage to be himself. It's that leads him to quit as president of the International Psychoanalytic Movement, the editor of its main journal, and resign his post as a lecturer at the University of Zurich. And by the way, I think that the latter was the more important decision, in the sense that to actually leave his position as a lecturer at the University of Zurich, which gave him a lot of, you could say, prestige and standing, would have been the hardest thing to do.
Why did he do that? I mean, why did he decide to leave the prestige so he can pursue his own personal work?
I mean, he says in retrospect, how could he teach people if his ideas weren't clear and he was still trying to formulate things? So he had to, in a way, reach an understanding himself before he felt ready to teach people. You find people would be more inclined just to recycle their old lectures and get paid for it, instead of admitting that they don't really know what they're talking about, or are unsure about what they're saying.
Yeah, there is a lot about taking time apart to think about your ideas and actually to experiment, in a sense that maybe I'm returning to something we already talked about, but he living before the divide of spiritualism or spiritual or
psychical research.
Psychical research, yeah, he can form an experiment which is I'm guessing Jungian scholars today doesn't necessarily pursue active imagination, but study what Jung has done.
One needs to differentiate practitioners, therapists from scholars. So scholars hopefully do good historical work. What they do in their own personal life is up to them. It's not part of the work that they're putting into that they're necessarily putting into print, or not necessarily connected with their own work. In terms of psychotherapy, Jung's practice of active imagination is in many ways the key modality that he's introducing into psychotherapy, and it forms one of the main kind of like contexts that gives rise later to art therapies. I mean, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the things that contributes to the development of, could say, non-verbal approaches in psychotherapy. I.e., the notion that if you're stuck and you don't know what to say, why don't you just take a pen and start seeing what it says, or take a brush and seeing what comes out.
Yeah, I came to know that this technique via Julia Cameron's morning pages, which is very different in a sense, but it is, I mean, do you know it? It's writing 3 pages a day, and it's more for the, if you want to develop as an artist, as a writer, and
Yeah.
so on. You just write 3 pages a day of basically whatever comes out, and yeah, and you develop your, I don't know, your confidence and so on. And I'm wondering how known was the Red Book before its publication in 2009, because it wasn't necessarily a secret, but Jung never published it. I mean, did he wanted to publish it? Did he thought about publishing it?
I mean, first to the first part of your question, it was known about in Jung circles. He spoke about it in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. A few images of it were published, I think, in 1979, and annually our Facebook Word and Image, so that it was a mythical object that was seen as significant, and Jung had described it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, but people, it wasn't accessible except for certain trusted followers that Jung had given a copy to. I would say Jung was working on it for public. It was a work that it was intended for publication. He was working on it for publication and made many. It was having it transcribed. Editing it, was looking at different ways in which he could publish it. In the mid-20s, he decides to publish it anonymously and uses a novella in which he attributes it to a patient called A.E. who's asked him to write a preface for it. So this is one of the attempts that he makes to try to, as one way of publishing it, as if it's the work of an anonymous patient who's asked him to write a preface to it. He leaves that aside. So it's something that he feels it's intended for an audience, but he is reticent about putting it out in his own lifetime. So I think that he would have had a sense that it would be available at some point. So he left various stipulations that maybe it should be put in an archive and given, accessible after 30, 40 years or something like that. Again, which are actually the same stipulations he gave with his correspondence with Freud. And I think it would have been much better if this had been published at the same time. It would have saved a lot of historical misunderstanding if this had been published in the mid-70s.
Yeah, but it is published in 2009, and you're
That's right.
and you're the editor of the book. Can you tell us about a little bit about the process of editing and publishing the book?
Yes, I mean, I was doing my historical research, and I learned that Jung had it transcribed, and started looking for copies of transcriptions and found them. Found, you could say, one full transcription and one part transcription. And at that stage, I was in communication with the former Society of Heirs of C.G. Jung, as I had edited Jung's seminars on Kundalini Yoga, and that started a conversation, and they asked me what I thought about it, and that then they started a conversation which lasted 3 years as to what to do with it, and then it was decided to release it for publication.
What were the other options? I mean, to speak 3 years about maybe publishing and then deciding to publish, it seems like a long time.
For those familiar with these matters, that was a relatively quick time period. It became clear that this was, in effect, it was a work written for publication, although it was not published, and it formed the basis of Jung's collected works.
As opposed to a secret, not a secret, but like a private diary almost. That
That's
I
right.
mean,
It's not the mad ravings of someone stripping naked and running around Lake Zurich.
yeah, which was something Jung thought about. I mean, he is asking himself in a sense, "Am I going mad?" And coming with the idea that no, a madman or a person who has a mental illness couldn't control the vision, but he's actually that's the active part, no, of the imagination. He's summoning them in a sense.
He is summoning them. I think some of that is, I think, slightly tends to be overplayed. In that, I mean, I teach a course on the history of psychiatry, and I begin by asking, is anyone here not at some point in their life feared they'll be going mad? And you usually don't find anyone putting up their hand. So in a way, it's a mark of sanity to fear that you're losing it. And there's a sense in which Jung has his waking visions of catastrophic sea of blood overwhelming Europe, but not Switzerland, in 1913. And from his accounts, he views this as a prospective interpretation. What could this image mean? That he thinks this image indicates that this is going to happen to me. So it's a way. It's not as if like there's a difference between the fear when you feel like I'm losing it, and something that is an interpretation that this is what might happen. And in his view, he was studying the same contents in the form of these fantasies that people who do undergo a psychosis get flooded by. It's the same material, but he was doing this in a I would say in a very controlled and intentional manner. And by the way, it's material that you could say serious artists are familiar with the whole time. It's not like anything particularly unusual about exploring symbolic expression and inner fantasies. And if
Yeah.
you look at Jung's material, it's incredibly controlled and elaborated.
And he's in dialogue with the beings that comes to him, and he asks
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, he's not letting them always take the reins, which is, I mean, is Nietzsche an example to Jung in a sense of what not to do?
Jung does read Nietzsche as an example of what he understands as a failed individuation. So he does see Nietzsche as a cautionary tale of someone that, as it were, gets lost in the depths, that identifies with the figures, that doesn't keep his feet on the ground.
And I'm wondering because I remember the first time that I've heard about the Red Book, which was actually years after it was published. It was maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah, it was, I mean, such a mysterious thing that you felt that you have to read it. And I'm wondering how could you explain, or if you could explain its success, because it seems like since the time it was published, I mean, before we started, I told you that I have an equivalent podcast in Hebrew, and I've already recorded like maybe 40 or 50 episodes, but the most successful one by far is the one about Jung's Red Book. I mean, people seems to be attracted to it and to, I mean, the general reading public. It's in a sense of a phenomenon, and how could you account for that?
I mean, someone is now engaged in producing a translation into Hebrew, so that's in the works. It'd be interesting to see what response that has. I would say at a very simple level, you could summarize it if I had to give a postcard description and say it's a story of how Jung lost his soul and what he had to do to refind it and recover meaning in his life. Now, there are elements to that that resonate. There are elements to that quite a few people will feel like, okay, I've been there. And to see what it took Jung to kind of find his way forward has, you could say, proved of inspiration to people. So to me, I wasn't surprised that it had it reached a wide echo, nor was the editor at Norton, Jim Mars. It was his kind of you could say genius as an editor, as a publisher, to say, okay, we just produce it as is on a one-to-one scale without reducing the size of the image, and we don't even put an image on the cover, which most people would think you're completely insane to put a heavy illustrated book without an image on the cover, which took quite some task to convince the marketing department. You just produce it as is. You realize, look, this is a book that's not like anything else. So there's a book that creates its own audience. You can't use what you'd expect. You can't judge it. You can't make calculations based on other things because it's an exceptional work. So you have to produce it in a way that it does manage to shape its own audience, which it did.
Yeah, and I'm sure you got like many responses that you haven't even imagined that you're going to get from various readers. I mean, I am
Sure.
not just scholars are reading this book, obviously. I mean, it seems that not everybody, of course, the world is a big place, but many are interested in it for various reasons. No, I mean, everyone can champion in it.
I had emails from people saying, "Look, I'm just so glad to read this because it shows I'm not nuts. You know, there's someone else out there
Yeah.
experience these things." And so you don't have to be a Jungian because it's in a way it's not a Jungian book. There's no abstract terminology in it. There's no you could say official psychology in it because it's written on the basis of first-hand experience. Which is okay, this is what he experienced, and this is what he's been able to make out of his experience.
Yeah, in a sense, it's like Dante's Divine Comedy, just without. I mean, Dante has his already. I mean, he has his worldview already. I mean, the Christian worldview already developed. He doesn't have to go out and search for it. I mean, the character in the book is searching for understanding, but he finds what is already out there, of course, and the gospel. And Jung is actually searching for a myth, which is so interesting to see him search for that. And he doesn't have a jargon in a sense because he hadn't created it yet,
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
And he's going to create it from what he's going to experience.
Yeah.
And 4 years ago, I think, you've published and edited the Black Notebooks.
Yeah.
Which is almost like going a level down and
Right.
to that's even before the editing. What can you find in the initial notebooks that you wouldn't find in the edited Red Book?
I think there are a couple of, I would say three main things. You find the Red Book was a work that is written, a literary work that is written on the basis of his self-experimentation. So what Jung's leaving out is things like reflections on his mental states. So in a way, the Black Books are a lot more moving because they're much more immediate. It takes you right into it. Second, you find the continuation of Jung's fantasies from 1960 and onwards up into the late 20s, which goes beyond the material of the text that he transcribed into the calligraphic volume of the Red Book. And you find that the images in the Red Book only make sense when you put them in that sequence because they don't refer to the text of the Red Book at all, or at least 3/4 of them don't. But they're much more closely aligned with the texts in the Black Books. And you also find then also how he constructed the Red Book in a way that they're works that are deeply connected and each clarify the other. So it's like one large unpublished manuscript corpus. It's a double-sided coin that are best read together.
The work never ends in a sense. I mean, if you want to understand Jung's oeuvre, you need to read the Red Book and then the Black Books. It's I loved your idea of Jung as an esoteric. I mean, you have to peel layers and layers, and I mean, is there a specifically memorable episode that Jung encounters or experience or experiment in the Red Book for you?
To me, the whole thing. I mean, there are many. It just depends which day.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great answer. So thank you for this wonderful talk. And before we end, I told you that I have a recurring question, which is I always end by asking my guests for further reading recommendations, which could be connected to Jung or connected to anything that we talked about in this conversation?
Well, with regard to Jung, I would say the best text that gives one an introduction to his work is his seminar in 1925, which is the first text I recommend. I did a revised edition of it about a dozen years ago under the title Introduction to Jungian Psychology. That's out from Princeton University Press. So I think that would be the first text I'd recommend.
Before the Red Book?
Together with...
Together, yeah. To understand his scientific concepts and ideas.
Well, everything, because he then gives an account of his intellectual trajectory and gives an account of his self-experimentation.
Yeah, very interesting. Anything else, or?
I mean, I've tried to give, you could say, an account that fits this material in the elaboration of his work called Jung, a Biography in Books, and that's out with W. Norton.
Yeah, which is the book you wrote.
Yeah.
Well, great. So we have our two recommendation, and again, thank you for this lovely, very interesting talk. And Yoon, as an esoterist, this is what I'm going to take from this conversation. And yeah, of course, you can see it all over the Red Book and his other writings. So thanks again.
Yeah, good to talk to you.